very Celtic riffs. The first phrase goes like this. Which is over an E minor chord, and the second riff goes. Which is over a G major chord. Now as you can hear, they're very Celtic, so I'll put the two of them together. I think Eric did a great job on that, kept it simple, kept it to the point, kept the emotion of the song.
On the studio recording of Whiskey in the Jar, there is no bass. It's basically drums, acoustic guitar and electric guitar. Now, Phil obviously was singing. It wasn't his song, so I rather suspect he was doing it a little half-heartedly. But on the TV recordings that you see, you'll often see him playing an electric guitar. Now, that is because obviously there's no bass, but I think he probably found the idea of standing up there with an acoustic guitar perhaps not macho enough for him.
Interestingly enough, it became a millstone around Lizzy's neck because it was such a big hit single, and it didn't really define their sound. It defined in a way the midpoint between the Eric Bell era and what was to become the Phil Lynott era, the era we know and love today. But because it was midway, it represented neither particularly well. It had that Celtic flow from the early days and had the rock imagery and attitude that was to be taken slightly further.
Once they'd had the hit, it was Thin Lizzy, Whiskey in the Jar, and it wasn't particularly a song that they identified with.
Here I am with a ball and chain, yeah, push a rain down my window. Wait for my daddy-o, wait for my daddy-o, there's whiskey in the jar. And I got drunk on whiskey-o.
Well, I think that the beginning of the Truth in Lizzy sound really started to become apparent in Vagabonds of the Western World, where you had songs like The Rocker. Eric Bell was in the band, and if you listen to Vagabonds of the Western World, it's actually quite an enchanting rock album to listen to. So I think it started to come together there, and then maybe the band and maybe even Eric Bell himself decided that it wasn't for him.
The problem Eric Bell had was he was very limited. He wasn't a particularly great guitarist. He was good, and within the limited style and range of very early Thin Lizzy, it worked quite well.
Technically, he's not the most proficient guitar player in the world, but he had a sort of very fluid, very flowing, very sort of quite a creamy guitar sound, which was not dissimilar to Paul Kossoff of Free. He was more lyrical as a guitar player, and the style at the time was, it was sort of Page, Beck, Iommi, Blackmore, kind of very heavy, sort of hard rocking guitar styles. So it was actually a breath of fresh air to hear him playing something that wasn't actually out and out rock music. It was more kind of Gaelic music within the context of a rock band. And that's what made it interesting. That's what showed off Phil Lynnott's voice as well.
But as time started to develop up around the time of Vagabonds of the Western World, that's when Phil Lynott emerged as the leader. He was the one with the stroke of genius, the touch that was going to take Thin Lizzy further if anybody could. And Eric Bell had got left behind by them. And realistically, if you listen to Vagabonds of the Western World and Nick Tauber's production, which is underrated, it starts to concentrate on Lynott, and Eric Bell is very much relegated to the position of a sideman. He had his talents, he wasn't a bad guitarist, but in reality, he was the guy who was holding Lizzy back.
A lot of people would debate whether he was ever going to be the right guitar player for Thin Lizzy. The rumours abound about why he left and, what he did, but I think time proved that he probably wasn't a hard enough character to carry it off.
Eric, I think, was not keen on the rock and roll lifestyle, quote unquote, and obviously with events that were to come, he was to be proved right. But he played a New Year's Eve gig in Belfast, I think it was 1973, and vanished into thin air, just didn't come back. He'd had enough, off he went, and obviously that pushed Lizzy into finding another guitarist. In matter of fact, they found two, and that was what gave them the blueprint for what was going to be a very, very successful second chapter.
When Lizzy came to their fourth album, Nightlife, they made radical changes in their lives, as it were. Eric Bell was out. Gary Moore came in very briefly for touring purposes, an old pal of Phil Lynnott's from Skid Row days. And then he was gone. Lizzy then tried two guitarists. They brought in a guy called Andy G and John Ducan. Ducan had worked in Atomic Rooster and was to go back there. And they started to develop the twin guitar sound. Now, unfortunately, it didn't work out with Andy G and John Ducan, but having tried that, Lizzy went the whole hog and said, we're going to go that way. We're not going back to one guitar. So they brought in an American called Scott Gorham and a young Scot called Brian Robertson. And that's when the twin guitar sound, which became so much a trademark of Lizzy, happened.
My wild one.
I think the twin guitar setup, obviously it wasn't new in rock music. The Allman Brothers had been doing it in America. Bands like Wishbone Ash had taken it on in Britain. But I think Thin Lizzy really established it as, if you like, a hard rock or heavy metal standard formation. And obviously Scott and Brian, very different characters.
I think Scott Gorham brought to Thin Lizzy, as well as some excellent guitar playing. He's a very sort of good-looking, pretty boy in a sort of American kind of way. So I think he brought a touch of a hint of glamour, and also he provided he was the sort of lighter, sweeter guitar sound, which was a perfect foil for Robertson's darker, sort of higher, energized guitar.
At his very best, Brian Robertson was one of the great British lead guitarists. He had a sense of melody. He could make guitars talk. He could actually bring tears to the eyes the way he played. He had a real passion for the instrument. And when he looked into some of his solos, you could actually feel he and his guitar became as one. In the pantheon of great guitarists, Brian Robertson's definitely up there in the top echelon. But because of other problems, I don't feel he ever really developed his potential to its fullest extent.
Scott Gorham was a great player. I think he was a highly underrated guitar player, and he always played. He was foil or second place to whoever else was in the band, but in actual fact, he was clearly, I think, if you listen to the music, as good as, if not in many cases, better than whoever he was playing with.
But on stage, the mixture of the two, it was the chalk and the cheese, and somehow they knew where to play and where to lay back. And obviously, over the course of 3 or 4 albums, and much touring, they refined that and perfected it, and as I say, it's now a standard.
So they'd basically be playing the same riff guitar part, but Scott Gorham would usually play it a third above, like what's called a harmony, a third above or a third below, thus giving this sort of classic that Lizzy sound. So I think he understood that very well, and that was his invention. He was probably encouraged by Lynott and Downey, but I think he came up with that. I think that probably Brian Robertson was playing a couple of solos or more themes, motifs on songs. I think Scott Gorham eventually found that it sounded really cool by just basically doubling, but in harmony, everything that Robertson was doing, and it worked to great effect.
Also, another thing that